Yes, it's a pleasure to be here again, and it's always a delight to hear Walter deal with the questions and to see the response of everybody. It's easy to see why you people enjoy hearing him do that. It really is a delight. This morning, I have a couple of preliminary announcements, and then I'm going to give you a short lesson on the defense of the faith, on apologetics. For the people in my class who are here today, I would advise you're coming here again a week from today. I must be out of town myself, and therefore Walter will be serving as my substitute next week, as I am in part serving as his substitute this week. The preliminary announcements are these. First of all, this has been announced in here twice, but we want to make it once more. There will be a trip to the Passion Play at Oberammergau where Walter and I will be serving as co-hosts. Are there people here who have not received a copy of the brochure announcing that trip? It is a colored brochure. All right. I wonder if somebody would help me. Those brochures are right over there next to the briefcase. Would somebody be willing to pass those, not just somebody, Mr. Bodine would be willing to give those to people who put their hands up? Yes. Yes. There are only 60 places in total on that trip, and at last count there are about 20 of those places still left, and the registrations are coming in steadily. So if you'd like to make that trip with both of us, you really ought to consider it as soon as possible. There is another trip identical with that, but on that trip you'd have to put up with me alone, because Walter will co-host on the one the first 2 weeks of June, but not the one the last 2 weeks of May. This is the trip to the little town of Oberammergau, where the finest passion play in the world is given once for a single season each 10 years. Details are given in the brochure. I won't say anything more about it, except to recommend that you look at the brochure very carefully. If you don't go this year, you will not have a chance to do that for another 10 years. And this might be the last of these before our Lord comes again. That's perfectly possible, right? Because his coming is imminent, meaning that we should say every day, even so come Lord Jesus. Then the second preliminary announcement, and this refers to something Walter alluded to, has to do with the Evangelical Law School that will begin operating this next fall. It will take place on the premises of the Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa. Calvary Chapel has made its educational plant available for the beginning of a Christian law school. This law school will offer a full program for preparation for the bar, and it will also offer a Master of Arts degree in the defense of the faith. The Master of Arts degree is a one-year program for those who already hold a baccalaureate degree. For those wanting to enter the regular law program, only 2 years of college are required for entrance. The Associate in Arts degree, or its equivalent, that is 60 semester hours or 90 quarter hours of recognized credit. If you would like information about this, we have up here a leaflet. And therefore, after the class, if you want to come up, just take one of those. It gives you the address for obtaining the catalog. The catalog is in press now. You'll have it in about 2 weeks if you order it, following the directions on this brochure. All right. I want to talk with you on the defense of the faith this morning, and I'm going to tie law together with the defense of the faith. I want to show you, by 2 or 3 illustrations, how helpful it is to use legal reasoning in defending the gospel. These will be simple illustrations. They will not require any background in the law, but I think they can be helpful to you so that you see the possibilities in integrating these two areas. Peter tells us that we are to be ready always to give an answer. The Greek is a defense for the hope that is within us. The word defense there is the word apologia, from which we get the term apologetics, the subject having to do with the defense of the faith. That Greek word is a legal term. It's the term that was used for the defense in a trial in ancient Greece. And an apologist was the person who did the defending. He was the defendant in a trial. When Peter uses this expression, he has that background in mind, that Christians should be on the defense for the gospel of Christ. They should give a reason for the hope that is within them. The question, the $64,000 question, of course, is what kind of a reason should be given for the hope that is within us? Because there are many different reasons that can be given for anything. For example, there can be the reason of intuition, can't there? I just feel that it's right somehow. It's got to be right because it feels good. That is a kind of reason. It's a reason based on intuition, but it nevertheless is a reason. Unfortunately, most evangelical Christians do not give very good reasons to unbelievers when they're asked about the hope that is within them. We're not saying that evangelicals don't give any reasons. They surely do. They don't just keep repeating the hope over and over again. They give reasons, but the reasons are often very unsatisfactory. Why? Because these reasons are very often, quote-unquote, Christian reasons. That is to say, reasons that only make sense if you're already a believer. The unbeliever says, how do you know it's true? How do you know the resurrection is true? The believer answers, because Christ lives in my heart. Now, for a person who's already experienced Christ in the heart, that's certainly a good reason. But it isn't a good reason for a person who hasn't experienced Christ in the heart, because that person can't tell whether really that is going on. I don't want to be sacrilegious, but how does the non-Christian know that it isn't stomach trouble that you're having? A gastric disturbance of some sort? Or that you have created this feeling inside of you? Now, you know you haven't, but that's because you've had the experience. The non-Christian who hasn't had it has no way of testing it, so that isn't really a good reason for him. We'd quickly recognize that, wouldn't we, if somebody else used it on us. Suppose you were talking to a Buddhist, and you said to the Buddhist, well, why? Why do you believe that? And the Buddhist says to you, because of special reasons that you only really understand after you've become a Buddhist. You wouldn't be satisfied with that, because obviously anybody could say that. And if you had to try every religion before you discovered whether it had anything going for it, life wouldn't be long enough to try all of these. And what would you do? Alphabetize them and try them in alphabetical order? My goodness, before you got up to Christianity, you'd be so jaded psychologically, you probably couldn't tell the truth if it had a sign on it. You'd go through Ahmadiyya, Buddhism, Baha'i, etc. before you even reach Christianity, right? Christian Science, I think, comes before Christianity alphabetically. And it's taken people years to dig themselves out of positions like that after they've gotten into them. We need to give a reason for the hope that is in us that makes sense to people who haven't already tried Christianity. So the question is, where do you get reasons like that? Well, you can get them lots of places. But one of the places which offers a tremendous treasury of reasons and reasoning for the faith is the area of the law. Why the area of the law? Well, because lawyers have to work with evidence. Indeed, one of the fields of the law is the field of evidence. It's interesting that if you go to theological seminary, you never take a course in evidence. But if you go to law school, you have to take a course in evidence. One of the subjects for the California bar examination is the subject of evidence. This is a major course in law school. Why are lawyers so concerned with evidence? Because the law helps people to resolve problems that produce conflict in society. When people have conflicts, there are really two ways to deal with these. One is to go out and bash your neighbor over the head with a blunt instrument. You two have a conflict. All right, you go over, you hit him good on the head. And if you're bigger and stronger, then presumably the problem is solved in your direction. On the other hand, there's always the unhappy possibility that he will be bigger than you are. And then you quickly see that isn't a very satisfactory method of handling the thing. So the law enters in to provide a better method of dispute resolution, of resolving disputes. The law, therefore, has got to be able to analyze evidence and determine what person has the best reasons for the position that he takes. Really, courts of law are simply laboratories in which two sides present reasons in order to convince the court or the jury that they are correct. And so lawyers refine the question of proof, the question of evidence, more than other people do. They have to do this. You've got to have a very refined method of determining who has the facts on his side in order to get the disputes resolved in society rapidly and effectively. We therefore can take a look at the law and see ways of proof, techniques of evidence that can be useful in speaking about the hope that is within us. And look at the advantage of this if we find such techniques. The advantage is that the non-Christian has to pay attention to those reasons. Why? Because he uses them all the time himself whenever he has a problem that leads to legal action. If the non-Christian says, I don't like that kind of reasoning, the proper reply is, well, in that case, you haven't got any right to go to court. You haven't got any right to maintain the legal system that is the cement that holds the society together. You're reduced to bashing your neighbor over the head then, because the very reasoning that we're using is the reasoning that you have to use when you have a problem that needs to be resolved. This is the principle of hoisting the other person on his own petard, right? He has to use certain kinds of reasoning because the society can only function with those reasonings. And therefore, when we turn around as Christians and say, all right, notice how that same kind of evidence will work for the Christian faith, he needs to pay attention to it. Now let me give you a concrete example of how legal reasoning can help in the defense of the faith. Here's a little technique that you can use yourself when people pose problems about the truth of Christianity. Most of you have heard of the book by Van Daniken, Chariot of the Gods. Chariots of the Gods, right? That book suggests that when miracles are supposed to have occurred in history, and especially miracles in the lives of great religious leaders, the reason for this is that space creatures have entered into our history, and they have had knowledge beyond what we have, and so they're able to do things that you and I can't do. So great religious leaders are really people from outer space, creatures from outer space, who have abilities beyond our own. Right? Now, that sounds a little bizarre as I state it that way, and of course, one of the reasons is that it is bizarre. But if you look at the Chariot of the Gods, you see that that kind of argument is presented with all kinds of apparent literary background and the rest of it. It sounds persuasive to people who have read that sort of thing. So sometimes when you present the resurrection of Jesus Christ as the reason for your hope, the non-Christian will say, well, couldn't Jesus have been a creature from outer space who was able to do these things by techniques that we don't know? Why do you have to go along with him as God just because he performed miracles of that sort? Usually, Christians have an awful time with that sort of thing. They really do. Why? Because the non-Christian will say, well, isn't it possible? Couldn't that have been the case? Couldn't it conceivably have been so? Well, you know, the answer to that philosophically is yes, it could conceivably have happened that way. As the philosophers say, ours is a contingent universe. That term means that anything can happen in the universe. The universe is not such that you know about certain things that can't happen. One philosopher has said anything is possible but squeezing toothpaste back into a tube. The close encounters of the third kind could conceivably happen, right? Right. So the Christian is left wondering how to deal with that. Okay, I will take you to the courtroom. Take you to the courtroom. It's a murder trial, right? The victim has been found in a locked room. The door has slammed shut. There are no windows or other access to this room. The victim is found in this room. He has been subdivided into 18 equal pieces. And inside the room, along with the victim subdivided into 18 equal pieces, is the accused. He is holding a bloody axe. He is brought to trial, and the trial doesn't last very long, really. It's fairly short because there aren't a lot of facts to present. The facts are presented, and the jury retires. And after having a delicious lunch at the expense of the state, the jury files back in. The clerk says, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Foreman gets up and he says, "We have. Your Honor, we find the accused innocent of the charge." The judge wakes up, appears to be moving toward apoplexy, and asks for some kind of an explanation. Foreman says, "Judge, the evidence was indeed overwhelming. We've seldom seen a case as strong as this. But, Judge, this is a contingent universe, isn't it?" The judge says, "Brr." Foreman says, "In this universe, anything could conceivably happen, right? Therefore, it's conceivable, Your Honor, that an invisible Martian got into the room by methods we do not know, and with his secret laser, he distributed the victim throughout the room in the manner in which we found him. And being an especially unpleasant Martian, he left the impression that the accused did it. Now, Judge, that's possible, isn't it? Isn't it possible?" At this point, the judge does have apoplexy. The entire jury gets it for contempt. A new trial is moved, etc., etc., etc. All right. Now, why wouldn't the court stand for that kind of reasoning? Because in the law, no decisions are made on the basis of possibility. Decisions are all made on the basis of probability. In a civil action, one where people don't go to jail or suffer criminal penalties, the test is preponderance of evidence. You weigh the evidence. You see if the evidence goes farther this way than this way, then the verdict ought to be given for this particular party, or the reverse. It's a weighing of evidence. In a criminal action, like the one we were talking about, the standard of proof is that you must not bring in a verdict of guilty unless you are convinced to a moral certainty beyond reasonable doubt that the accused did it. To a moral certainty beyond reasonable doubt. That's a higher standard of proof because, of course, in criminal actions, the consequences are much greater. The judge will frequently say to the jury in charging the jury, now, this doesn't mean, gentlemen of the jury, that you know to 100% certainty that the accused did it. The only way you could know that would be if you were present and saw the crime. But if you were, you couldn't serve on the jury. You'd then have been called as a witness. It's a question of whether you are convinced to a moral certainty beyond reasonable doubt, meaning that you can't figure out any other reasonable explanation of the crime besides that the accused did it. If you can't think of any other reasonable explanation, if there isn't any other explanation that will go with the facts, then you bring in a verdict of guilty. Otherwise, you want to bring in a verdict of innocent because we'd rather have a guilty person go free than to have an innocent person convicted. All right. In the particular example I gave, what was the problem? The problem was that the foreman of the jury used a possibility to determine the decision, which had no bearing on any facts in the situation whatever. It had nothing to do with probability. Probability consists of weighing the actual facts of the situation and seeing where the evidence goes. In that particular example, There are no reasonable alternative explanations in a situation like that. Any explanations have nothing to do with the facts. They are purely speculative. If courts went on the basis of speculation, if they went on the basis of possibilities, no legal questions would ever be resolved. And therefore, you couldn't have conflicts in society resolved through the courts. My goodness, trials are long enough as it is, right? The court calendars are glutted enough. It's clear what would happen if we ended up with a situation where we no longer went with the evidence. The law tells us that reasons have got to be factual reasons. They've got to go with actual evidence, not with speculation. Think about it for a moment. If invisible Martians could perform crimes like that in such a way as to have that as a reasonable explanation, then they could do anything else, right? Indeed, the judge might be a Martian, dressed in a judge's suit, so cleverly disguised that nobody could tell the difference. The argument that Jesus could conceivably be a Martian, dressed in a Jesus suit, and nobody could tell the difference, that kind of argument is as nonsensical. And that same kind of quote-unquote reasoning could apply to anything and everything. We don't base our lives on that sort of thing. And the courts don't base their decisions that influence life or death in a way like that. We can help the non-Christian to see that you've got to base your conclusions religiously on the evidence that actually exists and not on speculation. And what is the evidence? Well, Simon Greenleaf, in his work, The Testimony of the Evangelists, put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as it were, on the witness stand to see if their testimony would hold up in a court of law. And he was the greatest authority on common law evidence in the 19th century. His great 4-volume work on evidence was used in England, which was quite a compliment to the U.S. back in the 19th century. He concluded that those gospel writers are presenting eyewitness testimony, or testimony that derives directly from eyewitnesses, of such force that it would hold up in any court of law. No jury would be able to bring in a verdict other than that Jesus died on the cross and rose again from the dead. The law school that we're starting is named for Simon Greenleaf. It is the Simon Greenleaf School of Law, and one of the reasons that we've named it for him is because we are so much convinced that good legal reasoning applied to the truth of the Christian faith, to the question of the truth of the Christian faith, will indeed vindicate it. Another quick illustration added right onto this one. Nobody actually saw the resurrection, right? What they saw were certain events before it and then certain events after it. Suppose a non-Christian says to you, well, under those circumstances, we don't really know what happened. There's a doctrine in the law of evidence called, and it's given in Latin, res ipsa loquitur, which means the thing itself speaks. The thing itself speaks. Take this example. You're walking along the street. From a third-floor window, a Coke bottle comes flying out and bonks you on the head. You pick yourself up off the pavement, you look up, and there is only one window open on the third floor. You rush upstairs in a state of infuriation. You get to the third floor, and you find that there's only one room overlooking the street. And this is an empty warehouse. And in the empty room, there is a Coke machine. And there is a fellow burping. The window is open. Now, you did not see any Coke bottle fly out of the window. All you know is that you have an egg-shaped protuberance on your head that you didn't have before this event. You can successfully sue either for an intentional tort or negligence against that person, and you do it on the doctrine of res ipsa loquitur. The thing itself speaks. The argument is that if an event occurs which does not, in human experience, take place without a reason, and it is clear that you yourself as the victim have not contributed to the event, and there's only one person in a position apparently to have carried this out, by process of elimination, you assume that he did it. Now, you don't say that that's conclusive. It is not conclusive. But there is a presumption that the person did it. And the burden of proof shifts, so he then has to prove that he didn't do it, and not the other way around. And that's perfectly reasonable, isn't it? Because under those circumstances, Coke bottles do not simply fly through the air without any agency to cause it. And you didn't do anything except have the misfortune to be there on the street at that particular time, and he's the only fellow up there. All right, so by that type of reasoning, you conclude that certain things happen. That's not on the basis of speculation. That's on the basis of the use of facts under comparable conditions. That kind of reasoning can be used directly in the case of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We did not see him rise from the dead. Nobody saw him actually rise from the dead. But we have clear evidence that he was dead before that. Roman crucifixion teams knew their business. They had plenty of practice. And the text tells us that a sword was put in his side so that blood and water came out. Medical examinations of that sort of thing speak of that as the puncturing of the cardiac sac around the heart, lymph and blood coming out. He is dead. Then, subsequent to that, he is with eyewitnesses over a 40-day period. That includes eating fish with them. At the end of Luke 24, they think they're seeing a ghost. He asks them for fish. They give him fish and he eats it. When I did my book on the occult, I never found a single ghost who was interested in a fish cuisine. Ghosts generally have a very, very low gastronomical standard, and certainly it doesn't extend to fish, as far as we can tell. For a person to eat fish, the person is alive. He's alive with a physical body. All right, if Jesus is dead here and alive here, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. He did rise again from the dead, and he rose physically, not in some vague sense of the spirit of Abraham Lincoln wafting among us or anything like that. This is a matter of a specific physical resurrection. And my final example, and this is even quicker, has to do with those people who go around saying that in order to understand the Bible, you've got to use external evidence to criticize it, to determine whether it's really true or not. You come across these people. They're the people who rush around with geological evidence, or what they consider geological evidence, saying that the flood never occurred, and that Hammurabi's code says that Moses' code was only a deteriorated form of the same thing, and on down the line. People who use extra-biblical evidence in order to change or alter, modify, expand on what the Bible is saying. There's a doctrine in the law which says that a testament, cannot be altered or messed with by external testimony of any kind. If, for example, you are dumb enough to prepare a will with gaps in it, such as, I leave to my beloved dog Fido the sum of blank to be employed so as to provide him with the highest quality dog food available through the rest of his natural life, or something like that. And the will is examined after your death, and there's the blank there. You see, you didn't know with inflation how dog food prices were going to increase. And so you left that blank. You were intending to fill that in. With your dying breath, you were going to write in but you didn't do it. Now, it is not possible legally for anybody to bring witnesses in to say, Uncle George told me just before he died that the amount should be $5,000. Or Uncle George frequently said in his letters to me that he wrote, I'm going to give Fido $5,000. $5,000 is the amount of money for Fido. You can't bring any of that in. Why? Because a will or testament speaks for itself, or it doesn't speak at all. The testator is no longer around. And the whole point of the will is to have a definitive final statement of what the testator's wishes are. That's basic. That, incidentally, is why it's so important to have a will, and a good one. Don't be dumb enough to think that because you're living in California and that's under community property, it doesn't make any difference. You don't have a will. The state determines how your estate will be divided, and if you like the government to do that sort of thing for you, then I'm very much surprised. You don't like the government to interfere while you're alive any more than necessary, right? So why should you want them to do that after you're dead? But anyway, you can't vary the content of a will in that fashion. You ever noticed what the two parts of the Bible are called? They're called the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Jesus talks about the New Testament in his blood and contrasts it with the Old Testament. The Bible is, in a very real sense, the testament of the Messiah. It is the last will and testament that God Almighty gives to you. It is given so that following his death for the sins of the world and his ascension on high, you will have a final word as to what he expects of you in this life, and a definitive word on the way of salvation. If the Bible is seen as a testament, then this basic legal principle has the greatest relevance to it, that it doesn't make any difference what other people say God really meant. It doesn't make any difference what other opinions there happen to be from the realms of science, history, geography, or plumbing. It doesn't really make any difference. The issue is simply what God has put down in his final word to you. It has the same force, value, and effect as a testament, as a will. If we looked at it that way, it seems to me we'd be less likely to misuse it as we examine what it has to say about God and as we see what it has to say to our own lives. Putting it another way, we should always be standing under God's Word, listening to it. We should never be standing over God's Word, criticizing it. And we can help non-Christians to look at it that way and see how reasonable it is to look at it that way if we recognize the true character of it. These are simply three examples of the way in which you can employ good legal reasoning as a justification